So thank you very much. I think we're on time to start the next session, which is on a Green New Deal for the world. And my name is Demetrios Papathanasiou. I'll be moderating the panel in this discussion. I am the Global Director for Energy and Extractives for the World Bank. And it's a pleasure. We have with us Minister Claver Gatete, the Minister of Infrastructure with the government of Rwanda. We have Dolf, the Director for Innovation and Technology for IRENA, Ms. Laura Cozzi from the International Energy Agency, Mr. Will Cavendish, a Director with Arup, and Mr. Guyde, who's a Senior Policy Fellow in the Center for Global Development and also an ex-minister himself. So what we'll be discussing in this session is that there is increasingly among thinkers and academia, and now lately we have heard it almost loud and clear from our colleagues at the fund and others, that we should be working towards a greener world, that investments in greener infrastructure make a lot of sense and they have significant benefits. And we would like to do a check of how these ideas and the thinking on investing on cleaner infrastructure, how this actually translate on the ground with the experience that particular governments have, especially in the developing world. We would like to see how the thinking goes in some countries of the developed world. And we have our colleagues from IEA and IRENA who can help us with their modeling and insights on how we can all move towards a greener kind of infrastructure. So the way we will run this panel is we will start with a few minutes of remarks by each one of our panel members. So we will start with Minister Gatete, then we'll go to Guyde, then we'll have Laura Cozzi, Will Cavendish, and at the end of the series of panelists, Dolf Gielen will conclude with the perspectives from IRENA. So without further ado, I would like to call on you, Minister Gatete, if you could share with us what is the perspective from your own country in terms of infrastructure development, the greening of infrastructure. How was the thinking before COVID-19, and how do you see things happening today? What kind of challenges and opportunities you are seeing in your position in Rwanda? Thank you very much. Please unmute your microphone and go ahead.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much, moderator, for giving us the opportunity to share experience. The topic on decarbonizing infrastructure actually goes with the whole area of environment. And it's an area that we have been, as Rwanda, struggling with, not because we are doing it for the sake of doing it, because of the nature of the terrain and environment that we live in. Rwanda is known as a country of 1,000 hills, meaning actually that most of the parts is actually the hills that is constraining the entire stretch of our country. And this has implications on how we settle our communities, on how we do the kind of infrastructure that we do, whether it is road infrastructure, water infrastructure, and transport infrastructure as well. So this has really shaped us in such a that we're among the first countries to introduce an environmental fund. We call it FONERWA, long time ago. And to ensure that all the projects that we do in the country have to fulfill the requirement of the environmental impact assessment. This is regardless of which type of project that it is. And now we are going deep in terms of making sure that we are really bringing the greening part in the entire infrastructure domain. In transport, we are now really moving very fast to make sure that we have only electric vehicles. It's a project that we started and we are continuing in the country and make sure that we are promoting the walking, using the bicycles, but also discouraging anything that consumes fuel. And that means the cars, including now banning a project that we're working on, trying to limit the cars which are imported, the second-hand cars or the used vehicles that come from outside. We are really putting a limit, and soon we'll be taking a paper to cabinet to make sure that we can reduce as much as possible the imported vehicles and providing all the incentives for anything, electric vehicles, electric motor vehicles, and we are providing incentives to the extent that we have so many companies that have started this kind of program here. We're also introducing a tax on pollution, especially that goes to the vehicles. And especially now that we have the vehicle inspection that is mandatory to all the vehicles, the big ones being, of course, checked twice a year, and the small cars being checked once a year. Make sure that you fulfill all the requirements, otherwise you are off the road. We also make sure that whenever we do other things, most of the work that we used to do using actually vehicles, especially like the blood, like other things that can be transported, we are now using drones. We are finding alternatives to make sure that we don't use some of the vehicles that we normally used to use. But for now, we are also introducing several things in the transport sector to make sure that we can decarbonize it. The same thing on electricity, where we are targeting, of course, the United Nations target is having 60% by 2030. For us now, we are at 54%. But when you look at all the projects under development, for us, we'll be there very soon. We won't wait for the 2030 to reach there. And eventually, actually, it will go up to 90% because most of the energy that we anticipate, either hydro energy or methane gas, or it is solar energy that we are anticipating in the horizon. And also, we have worked with you, as of course, the World Bank itself, in terms of finding some resources for the biomass. Recently, the World Bank approved the 20 million, in addition to what we had from the government and from development partners within the fund that we have for environment. And this one is actually helping us make sure that we can have improved cook stocks for our population. We started doing something quite unique, where we had to get the big consumers of firewood out of actually the use of firewood. We started with the army, we went to the police, we went to the prisons, so that this time they moved to the LPG, not the use of actually firewood. And now we are moving to schools, the health centers, and other places, so that those big consumers at least will be off. And now we are focusing on how we deal with ordinary the population, some with relatively low income, others with very little income that they need direct government support. And that's what we are doing in terms of even for the access of electricity, but also on how to use the biogas, on how to use the improved cook stoves that limit the use of the firewood. So we have really done quite a lot in that area, but at the same time, we are using the energy efficient. The energy efficiency is really making sure that even the lamps that we see on the streets, where we are using the LED, we came from very far to make sure that it can last for long, but at the same time produce the same energy that we all want. So it's the efficiency in terms of how we use electricity has also become very, very important. In urbanization and housing, definitely we started with the government to lead us by example. We are now turning all government buildings into green buildings. It's now a requirement. Secondly, we are also using what we call wellness. We have an American company that is here on Wellness Lab. It's going to establish here in Rwanda, the Wellness Lab. And this is where we are promoting the environment on how also to do the buildings. What's the light that you use? How about the environment, the whole general environment, I would say, that we use here when you are doing the construction, what are the requirements, and so forth. So it's applied everywhere in housing. Our ministry is in charge of transport, in charge of housing and urbanization, in charge of water, sanitation, energy, all those things are in this ministry in terms of infrastructure. And we are trying to take advantage to make sure that we apply the greening part in all these areas. And for the ordinary housing, we have earmarked some places where we have to be only green buildings. And that's what we're applying. This is something that we take very seriously, because we know that if you have to attract investment, if you attract the people to come and live in Rwanda, especially all of you on your retirement want to make sure that you can find your way to come and live in Rwanda, we have to create the environment that would really meet your needs. And that's what we are doing to make sure that we are doing it for Rwandans, but we are doing it for everyone who wants to live in Rwanda. So we are trying our best. We are no longer there yet, but we are trying our best. Of course, COVID has had an impact on us. And especially, we have had to introduce some of the infrastructure, especially at the borders, because we had to continue the cross-border trade to sustain our own businesses. So we had to put so much infrastructure in place. We have established a fund, Economic Recovery Fund, that is helping so many sectors, especially those in the tourism sector, which have been hit very much because of the restriction on movement. The hotels, the restaurants, all of them have been hit. So those are really being helped by this fund. But also in the transport sector have benefited. Just to give you one example, the transport, when we opened the transport system, we found that the prices were going up and ordinary people already could not afford it. So as government, we had to find a way of subsidizing using the Economic Recovery Fund, but also using other subsidies to make sure that we can really allow the people, again, to have the free movement so that they can do their own businesses. I don't want to take much of your time because I know I've taken much of the time, but I'll be happy to answer any questions that anybody would have. We are trying, of course, we are struggling through the COVID, but we've tried everything possible to make sure that we can contain it here in Rwanda. And the numbers that we see now, it's like 5 people, 10 people per day of the getting infected with COVID. And actually, we believe that we've tried our best, but at least we are helped by the population, especially with the discipline of the population and working together with the policymakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. Again, thank you for taking the time to join us here. Let me now move to Mr. Judah Moore, who is now doing research at CCGD on infrastructure investment in Africa. But he was actually, just a while back, he was on the other side of Africa. He was the Minister of Public Works, and he had firsthand experience on the reconstruction of Liberia. And I would like to bring him in so that he can give us his perspective from his research, but also how he sees in this COVID situation and the prospects of a greening of infrastructure, how things move and how do governments on the ground feel about these developments. Over to you, Judith.
Thank you, Demetrios, and thanks to everybody for having me here, and welcome to everybody. I think first, my focus at the Center for Global Development, as you noticed, is, as you said, is on trying to attract what it takes, the challenges of attracting private financing into infrastructure. And what I've done mostly over the last 2.5 years is just complain of how difficult it is to attract private financing into infrastructure. First, it's just infrastructure is so heterogeneous, it's hard to do plug and play. And so even in developed markets, for large wealth managers, say pension funds, only between 1% to 3% of the portfolio is infrastructure. So if it's difficult in developed markets, you can imagine what it's like in frontier economies and emerging markets. So we've struggled to attract private financing. But I think it provides us an opportunity, and I just wanted to spend time using my experience when I was in government. As more than 50% of the roads, speaking about transport infrastructure, more than 50% of the roads are unpaved. And for us living in the tropics, we have very aggressive rainy seasons, which means that at the end of every rainy season or at the end of every 2 rainy seasons, you have to go back and do significant rehabilitation of the roads. And over time, there's been an erosion in terms of the availability of resources and materials that is used on the roads. And it's becoming harder and harder. So one of the things I noticed was that the distance between where we're getting material to where we're building the roads, the distance keeps getting longer and longer because we're using finite material. So as minister, one of the things I tried to do was to introduce technology in terms of chemical polymers and road stabilizers that allows you to use marginal soil, but by using the chemical, it allows it to have its load-bearing capacity again. And the attempt here was to create sort of a circular economy around construction so that we're not just using and consuming finite resources in the construction of infrastructure, but also in reusing that and making the infrastructure strong. Obviously, it was hard for us to do. And I think this is where the bank can be really useful, because our budgetary resources are so constrained. using it for experimental stuff is not the best option for a minister. And so if there is a possibility of support, I mean, some of this was as small as 25,000 that allows them to be able to do it, but it gives countries who want to green their infrastructure the ability to be able to try options to do that. The second thing was in Cape Town, at the University of Cape Town, a group of students were able to harvest urine and use it to make fertilizer, but that's not what I was interested in. They were also able to use it to make bricks that were really, really hard. And so here was the prospect of being able to take a waste product and convert it into construction material that it didn't require extra expenses, it didn't require extra cement or extra steel, but you could actually make your construction stronger. And so, but they also struggled with finding resources to be able to scale this. So I think because of the deleterious effect of climate change on our infrastructure, we saw the destruction of infrastructure in Beira during Cyclone Idai. I think there is a need now for us to begin to first invest as much as possible in new materials that allow us to be able to build stronger infrastructure without having a negative impact on the environment, but also prepares us for changes in weather patterns that allows us to be able to provide those. So the final thing I would say is that hopefully for the last 3 years, I've been trying to interest people in the possibility of a prize challenge that invites material engineers from around the world to compete on creating new products that allows us to be able to provide the same kinds of infrastructure, but at orders of magnitude cheaper, but also using materials that they didn't have before, allowing us to decarbonize the infrastructure we built. So I'd like to stop there and be open to any questions that people have.
Thank you very much, Judah, and thank you for bringing the perspective of how the focus on greening in the environment is also a challenge to be innovative and looking for new ways of doing things. Thank you very much for taking the time. So I would like to move on now to Ms. Laura Cozzi from the International Energy Agency. She's the chief modeler there. And she has a lot of experience of looking not only at the energy sector, but also at how investments in the sector for the greening of the sector can bring benefits and economic growth. I would like to say that Laura, as well as Dolf, have also prepared a series of slides that we don't have the time to go through them in detail now, but everything will be posted and you can take time and look at them in more detail in the website. So with this, over to you, Laura, please.
Thank you very much, Demetrios. Thank you for having me, and thank you for organizing this very important panel. I would like to articulate my 5 minutes introductory remarks over three key topics. The first one is really understanding what the COVID crisis is doing to the energy sector. The second is what can we do through the sustainable recovery plans that around the world we are all implementing to relaunch the energy sector, but also go into a much greener and more sustainable energy future. And third, maybe some reflections on how is it different this time from previous crises, and do we really have a different opportunity? So let me start with looking at the data that we have collected for this year. The situation is the following. We are seeing investment in the energy sector going down quite dramatically. We are seeing, compared to last year, a minus 20% flow of investment. And emerging economies are being impacted more than advanced ones. Although on a positive note, we are seeing renewables being more resilient than other sources. So this is a kind of mixed view, but with some positive stint to it. Of course, the decline in investment is coming also with implications for jobs. We are tracking nearly 6 million jobs lost across the energy sector. This can be efficiency, were mentioned earlier by Minister Gatete, but also in grids, developing grids, LPG distribution. So it's really affecting the entire chain. A third data point, which I think is very important, we are tracking for many years, as the World Bank does as well, electricity access. And we were very happy over the past several years from 2013 to say that actually the number of people without electricity access was declining in sub-Saharan Africa. The data for 2020 show that there is a reversal. Actually, we are seeing more people lacking electricity than in 2019. So when we put all these things together, we worked with the International Monetary Fund at the beginning of the year, assessed very detailed policy measures in the energy sector that countries around the world could undertake to relaunch the economy, but also bring back jobs and go into a more sustainable, more resilient energy system. And what we find is the following. If you divide in three buckets, three mega areas, efficiency, and here in this is in the industrial efficiency, but also building efficiency, transport efficiency. A second mega area, which is electricity. And here, not only solar and wind, of course, very important, but also grids, distributed generation and mini grids. And third, a third bucket of innovation, where we have more innovative technologies coming up. If you were able to channel over the next 3 years, very targeted, 2021, 2022, 2023, $1 trillion a year in those broad buckets. We have much more detail by country, but this is the broad areas. We would be able to have an economy by the end of 2023, 5% larger than we would have otherwise. CO2 emissions would be in structural decline, and importantly, we would create globally 9 million jobs every year. I'll pause for a second and delve into the electricity access and LPG, which was mentioned earlier. The worry we currently have is that we will see a permanent reversal if we don't act now. So we are really calling to governments, banks, multilateral banks, bilateral donors to look very carefully at what's happening. What's happening is that we have the distributed sector of solar in many parts in Africa, because of the lockdowns, were just taking off and have had tremendous difficulties. So we need to look at them very closely, but we also need to look at the grids part. Grids part, we were having projects either on mini grids equally emerging or larger grids that have been stalled for a number of reasons. We need to help the countries across the sub-Saharan African continent and at large in developing economies to come back with those investments. But what we are seeing is actually that borrowing costs are going up. Very different from what we're seeing in advanced economies, where we see very, very cheap capital everywhere. Is not the case in advanced economies. This is canceling some of the technology cost advantages that we are seeing with clean technology. I'm sure that Dolf will come back to this we have solar costs dropping very, very significantly, but financing costs matter as well. So really calling for a quick action to make sure that we put front and center the energy sector, which is going to be critical to provide essential health services, essential lights in homes, essential clean cooking. I'll conclude with those things on clean cooking. Currently, we are in a very unique situation in which LPG, which was mentioned earlier by the minister, is very cheap, very, very cheap. For a household that is currently using biomass with these cheap conditions, the payback would be around 1 year. But what's happening on the ground is actually that many people that have lost their jobs are falling back into poverty and falling back into using biomass. So safety nets there and supporting the LPG sector as well is going to be very critical. One concluding remark is not 2009. We have gone already through a big crisis, but back then, technology costs of clean technologies were much higher across the board. From energy efficiency to solar, to grids, smarter grids, digital, more efficient cars is really true across the board. This means a few things. They are more affordable. And importantly, they create for $1 million investment many more jobs than 10 years ago. So there is a real unique opportunity. However, we really need to look at the cost of borrowing to really take up the speed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you for taking the time and joining us here. And I really appreciate the focus that you brought in terms of how COVID is impacting both the investments, the cost of borrowing, and areas that we tend to forget in terms of clean cooking and distributed solar generation. Now, I would like to move on to our next panelist, and it's a particular pleasure to introduce Will Cavendish, who's now leads Arup's global digital services. Will is an old friend, and is a man that has had a very remarkable trajectory. I mean, he has been in the World Bank. He went to academia, both in Oxford and Imperial College, where I had the pleasure to meet him and be taught by him. And then he did important work on climate change with the UK government. He did important work with the health department in the UK government. And then he did very cool things on artificial intelligence. And now he's working on digital services. So Will, if I can ask you to look a little bit both on your government experience in terms of developing policies with a greening on infrastructure, and also what you see things now happening from the private sector, and the challenges and opportunities we have with the digital transformation that the world feels and that we all taking benefit of just to have this event right now. Over to you, Will.
So, Demetrios, thank you so much for that introduction. I feel like more like I've stumbled through life than there's ever been a clear plan, but it's very kind of you to say that. So, I think if we look at the world, and we look at the world here and in the future, we know that to meet people's needs over the next few decades, we're going to need massive provision of new infrastructure, and we're going to need to massively retrofit our infrastructure and buildings if we're going to meet those needs. But we also know that 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions are currently associated with either constructing infrastructure and buildings or operating them. Power plants, buildings, transport. And those are really cruel and powerful figures. And I think it's clear that if we're going to solve this challenge of decarbonizing infrastructure, we're going to need an all-in approach. We're going to need to put everything on the table to try and achieve that. The good news, I think, is that digital now does offer us quite a powerful new capability for both meeting infrastructure needs and cutting carbon. And I think 30 to 40% step change gains are already possible when we deploy digital skills, digital insight, digital technologies to the world of infrastructure. For example, if we take the example of planning and designing cities and places, it's now possible to use cheap and abundant satellite data and the power of machine learning to understand and design solutions for cities and places in a way we never could before. We've done a piece of work recently with Shanghai, where we've designed a drainage master plan, which by using satellite data to understand at a very granular level the city, we've been able to design interventions which involve more blue interventions, more green interventions than just purely pouring concrete in the ground. As a result of that, there's an urban master plan for Shanghai that is probably 30% cheaper, uses 30% less carbon, and is a green and blue solution to developing urban infrastructures that we wouldn't have been able to do previously. Or another example would be the powerful need to reduce embedded carbon as we build infrastructure. So we're now able to use quite sophisticated design and modeling tools to model the structures for concrete and timber high-rises in a way we never could previously. Now I think the world, and including Arup, is now designing 10 or 11-story buildings that use timber in a very, very successful way. Those designs are now reducing the embedded carbon in buildings and infrastructure by a half over what would have been the case, which is a huge benefit to bring. Equally, there are abundant opportunities for reducing operational carbon by tackling energy and energy efficiency, just as Laura was saying. So we can use things like generative algorithms and advanced techniques to really optimize energy systems in a way we never could before. And so we can derive pathways to net zero energy in buildings and net zero carbon in buildings, which get there quicker, cheaper, and more quickly than before, and save 15 to 20 to 30% of carbon over our current infrastructure. In many ways, the best way of avoiding carbon is to get the best out of our existing assets. The lowest carbon thing is something that isn't built, but we just use more of what we've currently got. So again, there are assets all the way around the world where by beginning to use the insights from data and engineering knowledge, we can actually safely extend the lifetime of assets beyond what was currently thought. So an example we've been working on recently is offshore wind, where the design life is dependent on the complex monopiles that are hammered into the base of the sea. We've been using the power of data now to analyze the performance of those and use that to optimize the performance of offshore wind systems. We can validate that those will last, considerably longer than their design life, and we can optimize the performance of offshore wind in a way that we haven't been able to previously by using the power of data and machine learning. That generates significant savings to offshore wind operators, but it reduces carbon quite significantly too. Ultimately, of course, we can use the power of digital and data to design net zero across the whole life cycle and embed circular economy principles. And that's something that we've done most recently with something called the People's Pavilion, which was a completely circular economy building with zero net energy and carbon across the life cycle. And that included using the ability to put in place barcodes and data systems in order to accurately track and really understand the performance and the provenance of the materials that's used and the full recycling of those materials. So it's a huge challenge to meet the needs of the population and reduce carbon. But I think, and we're going to need everything on the table to do it, but I think our experience and the experience of many organizations working in this sector is that digital is providing us a new opportunity to do those things. And I think is providing us an opportunity to achieve a step change in our ability to cut carbon while at the same time building the infrastructure that we need.
Many thanks, Will. I really appreciate your perspectives on digital and how this can help us to do much more efficient design, better use of what we already have. I really appreciate the insights on that and the net zero design. So the last set of opening remarks are coming from Dolf Gielen, who is the Director of Technology and Innovation with IRENA, and recently have done a very detailed report on reaching zero. So that's your comments, Will, are a very good segue to what Dolf is going to talk to us about. And just again, repeating that the Dolf has a beautiful set of slides that will be available in the website of the conference as well. So Dolf, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Demetrios. It's a great pleasure to join this panel today. We have 162 member countries, and that ranges from the size of China to small island states. And of course, the energy issues are very different for these different jurisdictions. But looking at the global trends, indeed what Laura said, we see that the gigawatts of solar PV and wind that are being added this year are roughly at the level of last year or slightly above. So that's already remarkable. But we see also that the renewable power generation as share of the total generation has gone up significantly. So that's also remarkable. And this positive news extends beyond the generation side. So if you look at electric vehicles, this year is probably 4 or 5% of vehicle sales, so also significantly up. And the cost of all these technologies continue to fall. And if you take, for example, battery packs, we're now talking levels of around $120 per kilowatt hour. So, and they continue to fall rapidly. So it's this combination of falling technology costs and increasing government ambition levels on energy transition that accelerate this development. So there's around 125 countries which have net zero emission objective announced. There's still a lot of work to be done to actually translate that into a plan and for the coming decades, but it's a very important step. And on the power sector, so globally we're at about 28% renewable power now, and that goes up by about a percentage point per year. And we think that that trend will continue and further accelerate because of this cost reduction. The main point of attention there is we need to find sufficient flexibility to integrate these variable renewables. And there is where digitalization and smart grids come in, what Will just mentioned. It's also very important for power systems. But we need to think also beyond hardware. We need to have the right regulations and market designs in place. So there's an important role for governments. We need to have in place the right regulations for systems operation and for allowing for new business models. So all of that, there is a role for government beyond investments. Now, moving to the end use sectors that you mentioned. So that is the next challenge in energy transition. How do we clean up buildings, industry, transport? And we've done that new study, and we come to the conclusion that in industry and transport, 54% of the solution is with renewables. So that is a remarkable high number, much higher than previous analysis. Again, the main reason why we find such a high potential is because of this cost reduction. It's really innovation that's driving this. And direct electrification is important, but also there's increasing attention for the use of hydrogen, and especially green hydrogen produced from renewable electricity. Now, all of this will only happen if governments put the necessary infrastructure in place. We need more and stronger electricity lines. We need new hydrogen infrastructure. And you need to think of this transition in not only in energy policy terms, but in terms of the overall socioeconomic impact. Can you create jobs? What Laura also mentioned. But what does it also mean for today's industries? And we get a lot of attention, questions from countries around the issue of opportunities of building new industries, be it hydrogen export industries. For example, currently talking with Morocco on that, be it around battery manufacturing and other types of new technologies. So who starts early will build an advantage and can also play a key role in developing these new economic activities. And final point, so I gave a number of examples of government roles in making this transition happen. There's a lot of attention for investment and financing, but there's also a lot of other aspects to enabling frameworks where governments have a key role to play. And that is really important to make sure that these enabling frameworks are put in place. And I'll stop there for my opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dolf. Thanks a lot. We have, colleagues, about a little bit less than 20 minutes for some questions or some discussions. We have received a couple on the chat, and I'm getting some more on my other device. But I would like to start by noting that we would have had one additional panel member joining us today, Mr. Diego Mesa Puyo, who is the Minister of Energy and Mining with the government of Colombia. And just this morning, I got an email where he sent his excuses for not being able to join us because he has to deal with an emergency aftermath of a hurricane that hit part of Colombia. And I think when I got his email this morning, it just really drove to my mind the actual vulnerability that we are all looking ahead of us because of climate change. And in a way, I felt this was like a timely warning. We have all discussed about the need for governments to do greener infrastructure, to aggressively go to zero, to net zero, and so on and so forth. So my question that I would like maybe to start off with is, what kind of policies do we need to see from governments? Is this the best way to give incentives so that people start moving, say, to electric vehicles? Is it better to say that we're banning alternative vehicles altogether? Given the urgency that we're facing, but also the lack of resources for major investments, especially at the time of COVID-19, and the fact that, you know, it is very hard to push to citizens or consumers much more expensive solutions sometimes. What do you feel is the best way for government to start and accelerate this transition? And I was wondering if Minister Gatete would like to discuss a little bit these issues from his perspectives, his experience from Rwanda on the policies, the green policy that they have. Which kind of approaches do you feel are more effective given this environment? And then maybe we can go to Will, Laura, or whomever else would like to contribute a little bit on this thinking about which policies are more effective and more appropriate for today's world. Minister Gatete?
Yes, thank you very much. Really for this, I was listening to my colleagues, and I think they really made very good points. Let me start for the, just as an example, the electric mobility that we are talking about. What we are providing is just some of the incentives that will make the electric vehicles as competitive as other vehicles. And we've seen the cost of the battery, we've seen the others. So we put the infrastructure in place. We provide the necessary subsidy and incentives for people to go that area. But as you mentioned, in terms of policy also, government rents vehicles for the workers almost across the board. And at the same time, government also buys vehicles. So when the government says we can only hire from companies that have electric vehicles, already that gives a direction on what actually these companies, if they want the government to rent from them, what they need to have in place. Then secondly, also for the employees of government, a policy that says that we can help you, we can subsidize you, we normally support you, but only we can support you if it is an electric vehicle or if it's a vehicle of this kind. Meaning that if you want the help of the government, actually have to go that kind of direction. But also encouraging the people in different areas to say, this is what is more preferred, meaning that you have really no choice but to go actually where there is a demand. So the government can influence the demand direction, in addition to the normal incentives that we give for the vehicles. Secondly, there are issues where you have to take policy decisions. For example, the greening part, where you put it in the building code, so that if you have to get a construction permit, you will need to fulfill all the requirements, including that greening requirement. So if you don't put it in the law, then it becomes very difficult for us to be able to enforce it. For us, that's what we do, and then put it in the law, and then everybody must abide by that because it's for the good of everyone. And that's why we are talking about some of the greening. We start with ourselves as government. All government buildings have to be green buildings. If they are not green buildings, then we should prioritize that in our own financing so that because we know the implication of that, we know the importance of that. So there are many areas. I can go to energy, I can go to all the other areas, you know, that, for example, let me just give an example of what we have been doing. In the energy sector, for us to be able to trace where the problems are occurring, sometimes you have to have the people on the ground who have to run around all over the country, and they are fixing things here and there. But then we realize that by using actually the drones, they can easily find where the fault is much easier and at less cost than anything else. The same thing with the roads, which are not really, the roads which are having some defaults as well. Using drones becomes very useful. Now we have reached the level where we are using the drones actually to do the topography, if you wanted to do the designs for any new road or existing road, they can take all the coordinates that can help us in terms of actually doing the designs without necessarily putting the people and the trucks and everything else on the ground to give us the same information. So now there are many ways on how we can really influence things. And this one here, by making sure that it's part of the policy, whether it is construction, whether it is transport, whether it is electricity, we can just, it's making sure that they are included in our own policies, they're included in our own strategies,
right,
and in our own laws.
Thank you very much, Minister. Will, can I tempt you to come into this? What do you think government policies and what type of government policies can be more effective as we try to accelerate things?
So I think as I was saying in my talk and others are saying, it is going to be an all of the above thing. Governments are going to have to use every tool at their disposal. But I think there are some maybe that are less appreciated or are certainly cheaper, which governments can helpfully use. One obviously is to go for the things that are win-win for everybody. So energy efficiency, we all talk about it, it never really happens, but that's a clear thing to be going after. The second thing is to recognize that 95% of all innovation happens outside any country's borders. And so governments should get really unembarrassed about borrowing and stealing from what's happening cheaply elsewhere and just bring it in. I mean, don't worry that it's not yours, just use it. And there's often that sort of national pride feeling that that's not to be done. The third area I would say is that Minister Gatete was talking about was the power of regulations and regulators, and really training up our regulators to be smarter and to be understanding better the decarbonisation needs and opportunity, and embedding those in regulation. Very powerful, particularly if it's multi-year, forward ahead regulation that shapes whole markets. But the fourth thing I would say is the investment in common standards. So we need to invest in our infrastructure networks, but for a digital world, we need to invest in common standards, data codes, interoperability criteria. And that's often quite sort of murky and boring work, but so important. It's not terribly expensive, but it does take a level of expertise. So I think we obviously need incentives, we need infrastructure investment, but I think there are things that we can do, that governments can do, which are effective but relatively cheap, but can have quite powerful impacts in taking us forward in greening and decarbonising our infrastructure.
So maybe if I can, if you allow me, I can just maybe give some examples.
Very briefly, please.
Yes. We have in Rwanda realized that actually technology has played a big part in this. In electricity here, for anybody purchasing water, electricity, you don't have to go anywhere. You just do it anywhere you are. In other words, if I'm in Europe, I can buy energy for my home in Rwanda, much, much easier. We've seen the use of technology in terms of the tap and go. In the transport system, all the buses now, 100% in Kigali, you don't use any cash. Yeah. And most of the other things also, it's cashless. It's tap and go, and that provides you all the information. And for the buses, if you are limiting the speed, we also have some of the things that we put in place because we had the innovation fund, which helped the people to develop some of the innovations. We have, for example, here, the technology that limits the speed of the buses because they are carrying so many people. There are accidents, but at the same time, for them to be safe, we have a technology that limits, that is compulsory for all these buses. So in addition to the normal speed, it's not just putting a limit, but also there is a technology that will prevent you from moving beyond that. So the Innovation Fund has helped us do so many things in terms of really using the technology to solve most of the problems without necessarily putting even the rules in place. But you put the rules also when you see that the technology has worked, and then that's when you can roll it out. We now use, there's for motorbikes, for cars, for taxis, for everything, it's cashless in Rwanda. So all you do is, people are used to it, that you only use your telephone to be able to pay for anything and receive anything. People are now used to it, ordinary people, and it is working. So there is a policy, for example, on the cashless that has helped us in terms of solving some of the, quite a lot of problems. During the time of COVID now, where we don't need, and it is now that we should not use really cash, it has helped. And now that's why in terms of financial inclusion for us, we went from 42%, we are now above 90% in terms of the financial inclusion within the country. And the use of mobile has really helped in terms of really solving
That's right.
problems.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much for those examples. Let me ask you a different question. We do have in one of the chats a comment which is not the first time that I see, and the question that is posed is, well, is it true that electric vehicles are a better option than combustion engines? And aren't we making more damage through the mining part of it? And how dependent all these benefits are on the actual underlying energy mix. And I was wondering if Dolf and Laura could come briefly on these issues and give us their perspectives.
Laura, you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. So it certainly depends on the energy mix. There are countries in which you have still very much coal-based generation where electric vehicles would not necessarily have the immediate CO2 benefits, but they would have the benefits on cities reducing emissions. Obviously, everyone talks about decarbonizing electricity first. So at a certain point, every country will have soon, hopefully, a similar tipping point. If you allow me, Demetrios, I would like, however, to say two things on the previous questions very briefly, and then I'll give it to Dolf to close on the EVs. Two things that I would like to see in these very unique circumstances we are in. This economic crisis we haven't seen since the 1930s. I think governments, we need to encourage them on two things. I agree with everything that has been said, but two things I haven't heard. The first, we're going to have 30 million additional people globally that will not be able to pay their bills in energy at the end of this year. We need to protect the poorest. This is going to be the first thing, and this is really squarely in government's jobs. First thing. Second thing, very often we focus on what are we building new in terms of infrastructure. And this is an absolute must to solve decarbonization. However, our analysis, very recent one, looking at what have we built up to now, power plants, iron and steel plants, our buildings, our cities, already with those, we have locked in temperature increase of 1.65. So another issue where I would like more focus of governments is what do we do with the existing infrastructure? So those two things I think are important, and probably wanted to bring them to.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks a lot for your contribution. Dolf, over to you on that question that keeps on popping up regarding internal combustion engines and electric vehicles. How do you see things, and how do you see the future of things? Because this is still a rapidly changing environment.
Yeah, well, first observation is that, of course, an electric vehicle is a lot more efficient than an internal combustion engine. So there you have already a significant gain. Even if you have a moderate level of clean electricity in your mix, then even in CO2 terms, the electric vehicle is already better. And of course, for what Laura mentioned for local air pollution, it's definitely better. I think in a number of developed countries, there has been a little bit of a policy mistake in a sense that most subsidies have gone to expensive electric vehicles. So you need to design a policy in such a way that you actually promote the small electric vehicles. Makes more sense. The other thing governments need to think about is, of course, you need electric vehicles, you need clean electricity, but you also need a recharging infrastructure. And that is also, if you have a rapid ramp up, as we see now, that can become an issue. So you need to think of that ahead of introducing these. And once the kilowatt hours needed are not that significant, but the kilowatts needed at peak times can be significant. So that's then where smart charging comes in. Again, it's something that in most countries, the energy policy is made by different people, then the infrastructure is made by different people that are responsible for the transport sector. So here you need a solution that crosses these borders, and these you need to get these policymakers out of their silos. They need to work together to make this work.
Thank you very much, Dolf. And with a closing question, we just have a few more minutes. I would like to return back to you, Guyde. We did hear that, yes, regulation is there, But at the end of the day, and the minister mentioned about the various funds and how critical and catalytic they have been in providing incentives. So that requires a substantial amount of financing. And both Dolf and Laura mentioned about the importance of governments to invest in infrastructure or help attract investment for infrastructure. And I was hearing you in your opening remarks about how difficult you said it is for the private sector to come and invest in Africa. So could you tell us a little bit, why do you think this has been so difficult? And whether you believe that if Africa makes clear commitments towards a greener infrastructure, as everyone appears to be increasingly converging as a design, do you think that this will help the private sector to look at things in a more positive way? And what do you feel can be done to get the private sector to look at these types of investments in a more positive way?
Sure. So I think a part of it is that we know that capital is a coward. Within the first 4 months of the coronavirus outbreak, we had over 100 billion exiting in private capital exiting emerging markets. And so part of the way we attract private capital is in the predictability of the regulatory environment and an increase in the quality of governance. And the Mo Ibrahim Foundation just released a report that saw that for the first time since 2010, we saw a year-on-year decrease in the quality of governance across Africa. And we think that's going to happen again next year. So I think a part of this is on us as Africans to improve the quality of our governance. And that is itself gives some sort of comfort to private capital to come and invest there. But I think one of the points that I wanted to make is that as we try to green the environment, it's important for us to understand the differentiation between our markets in developed markets and in frontier economies, right? In a lot of places like Liberia, like Gambia, Sierra Leone, we barely even have any infrastructure in place. So we're still in the process of building infrastructure. And green infrastructure, in a lot of instances, the efficiency and effectiveness and price competitiveness is not at that point yet. So we need to think about what is the project, the process that is more appropriate based on where the economy is. And so I think it's a combination of that. And then the final thing I would say is
a little bit like if summarized.
Absolutely.
All right.
Please go ahead, Guyde. We will wrap up in a minute, but I just want you to finish the point. We'll just slip over a little bit in our
sure.
for a minute.
I was just going to say that in the past
they're still answering some questions, so let's wait a couple.
By the way, one observation: once you finish your presentation,
can I please ask you to? I was wondering when we're going to have a technical hitch. Things were going very smoothly so far. Please, Guyde, make your closing point, and then we can wrap.
Well, I was just going to say that it's going to be harder going forward, and we have to find a way to be able to do this. And that's why I keep stressing on we need to make investment in technology that allows us to achieve it at orders of magnitude cheaper than we've been able to do. Because now most African countries are facing a huge debt crisis because of COVID-19. And so being able to ramp up infrastructure is going to be harder. And so I think organizations like yours, organizations like the Center for Effective Governance, and those who play a role here, investing in a kind of infrastructure, especially in new technology, I think will be useful in allowing us to do.
Thank you very much, Guyde. And I would like to thank everyone in this panel. I will have to bring this to a close. It's been really a fascinating discussion, and I really appreciate all of your contributions. We do have a set of slides also up. And with this now, I will wrap it up so that we can get on with the lightning talks on energy and transport. Thank you all so very much for joining us, and have a good rest of your day or